Many thanks, Alberto, and congratulations on building such a wonderful collection of palms. It's really enormously impressive what you've been able to accomplish in such a relatively short period of time. Now we have a little time for, first of all, are there questions or comments for Alberto, and then we'll go to some general comments before we break for lunch.
In his lowly English place.
My mother would have said, why didn't you get the other ones? But I'm pretty sure you will. Okay, well then let's open it to general comments, and you can bring up specifics about, oh, excuse me, Marcello. I can't see there.
I understand that one of the problems is also the question of plantation of drugs, maybe deforestation for use the land for cocaine or for this kind of that more money than the other things. Do you think this is a problem, really?
The solution of the people who plant coca, I think, is to give them a better way of life. There is no solution. Yeah. The police and the army and many people are fighting against that people, but if in other countries, the developed countries use cocaine for activities, they are demanding coca, and the countries in which the coca grows are planting coca. So it's the offer and demand law. Only the way they can do better things instead of planting coca will be the solution. There is no other. Because if the humanity said coca is okay and there is no forbidden anymore, it's a wrong way, I think. The most important way is develop the poor people in Colombia that live in that areas.
In a way, it's a vivid form of growing oil palms or cutting down the Cerrado to grow soybeans to send to China. It's just a more vivid form, and I believe it goes back to the principles that I've been talking about to an endless and boring degree, that rich and poor is a huge problem. A good life, a balanced life, and a socially just life is the solution.
Yes, Dr. Raven, my feeling is that we could help people to live better. Our palms, for example, we have 20% of our palms in danger of extinction. And many of them are used by many people as food, as medicinal activities for construction, for handcrafts, many things. We could help people promoting the plantation of palms. And in Colombia, if you ask someone which are the palms of Colombia, they didn't know, because as Monsignor Sanchez said, education is the better strategy for conservation. And we need to teach people what native plants are, and if they know, they love, and if they love, they protect them.
Thank you. Now let's turn to general questions. You could sit. Yeah, John.
Great, thank you. I wanted to go back to Christina Walters, and I wanted to disagree with one thing that you said, which was that your work is esoteric, and I think it's essential. So, concerning how essential it is, there was a comment that was made about either or, the idea of banking versus living material outside of banks and what you do with that. And I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy, kind of a zero-sum game. What we find in conservation is that resources that go to various aspects of what we do are not displacing resources from one another. There's committed funding sources, for example, in the United States that goes towards ex-situ efforts, including banking and those kinds of endeavors. Equally, there are many such funding sources that go exclusively to in-situ conservation work. And by and large, these are not competing sources of resources. There's an overall scarcity of resource for conservation as a whole, but each one of these aspects of what we do is part of a broad spectrum of what conservation is all about, ex-situ being a primary component of that. Ex-situ conservation in that broad spectrum fills many niches in terms of our ultimate goal of saving species. For example, with plants, if you're working towards conservation objectives, there are periods of time almost always, particularly in applied conservation, that you will have material, living material, out of the environment. Even if you're doing reintroduction efforts, whether it's just to collect seed to propagate and reintroduce into a population the following year, there's still an ex-situ component to that. So ex-situ plays an incredibly important role in what we do, including in all of our efforts to save species in situ. So I'd avoid bringing up this idea, again, a false dichotomy, not a true zero-sum game, in that ex-situ is a valid and incredibly important part of our overall efforts to save species.
Right. Bruno David?
Yes, at different time this morning on those 2 days, we spoke about the climate change versus biodiversity change. And if you allow me, I have just 2 slides that I put on the computer to show you very recent studies by some Canadian colleagues. So if I can have the slides, please.
Just like to raise a point.
No, wait, he's going to show 2 slides first. Sorry.
So it's a study by Le Gagneux and co-author published in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution last year. And this show in green the biodiversity hit in the media, in Canadian media, and in brown in the same media the hit for climate change. So across different years, starting in 1990 up to 2017, about. Yes, thank you. And you can see that there is a big difference between biodiversity and climate change, and you can see, if I can add that, here I put the date of birth of the IPCC on the left side, the date of birth of the IPBES, which is only 7 years old. IPCC is 31 years old. And you can see that climate change represents about 4 times biodiversity in total, the surface of the curve. And so we can expect, if we have the same rate of development of climate change in terms of hits in the media, we can have a kind of rendezvous in 2025, which is a bit far from now.
I have the same slide, almost the same, slice on it. But.
And in the same study, you have also 2 interesting things, that is the comparison always between biodiversity and climate change. On the right, on the left part, you have the total number of publications, and you can see that climate change represents 1.5 more publications than biodiversity in average. On the other part of the slide, on the right part of the slide, it's the total funding in US dollars, and you can see that climate change receives about 3 times more money than biodiversity. That's it.
Thank you very much. Further general comments on anything that's been said or anything else? Anything about this whole session? Yes, please, Virgilio.
Yeah, I'd just like to raise a point that I think was not very much discussed so far, which is conservation of plants associated with indigenous peoples. There is a lot of plants used by traditional people in indigenous populations that are being lost due to a number of factors. And many of these species are recalcitrant seeds, and some are not, but I think this is just an issue that I feel that needs to be given more attention, and I haven't seen it discussed. So in whatever publications we make here, I think this is a gap. And just to illustrate this, I was recently in Peru, in the Amazonian part of Peru, and there's a very interesting movement of protecting indigenous varieties of indigenous peoples themselves. So in Indian villages, there are people taking care of exchanging of varieties of plants. For example, pineapple. They had 13 varieties of pineapple in that particular location. And there was a woman who was in charge of curating that genetic diversity. So these kind of initiatives, I think, need to be given broader support and recognition.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Just to respond to that, there's a new publication actually just out from Kew called the Useful Plants Project that was based on a 10-year project funded by a philanthropist, a Spanish philanthropist who grew up in Mexico. And she was nursed back to health by her Indian nurse using native species. So she wanted to put something back into this, and so she funded a project of over 10 years in 4 African countries and in Mexico, doing exactly that, on working with local communities to cultivate useful plant species, medicinal, food, multiple uses. So it's a really nice compendium of 5 major case studies of doing exactly that. I'll send you the reference.
Well, if you could insert that in your paper, would be great, because I think this is really an important issue. There is a lot of wealth being lost of indigenous peoples in that regard.
The knowledge is being lost a lot more rapidly than biodiversity, actually. Other points? Yes.
I wonder that the issue of invasive species and globalization has not been addressed up to now. And I think it's absolutely a major problem. In Germany, I think we have about a biodiversity of 120%. And if you just count Florida or even Hawaii, you'll have more species than ever existed there. And invasive species are obviously one of the major reasons for losing species too, and it has not been addressed for some reason. Am I wrong?
In the Hawaiian Islands, there are more introduced species than native species, and many people can go there, leave, and come back without ever seeing a native species of a plant, which kind of makes your point. It's a huge problem. Yes, back row.
So, back. Okay. I was just going to say that the work that we're doing in Los Angeles with our Urban Nature Research Center, the scientists are tracking the invasive species. So they can tell where things actually get started based on particular nurseries that have the plants coming in from different locations and how those are spreading and moving out the native species. So that's the work that's been happening, and we've been able to see real dramatic changes in very short periods of time.
Yeah, botanical gardens in general could do a lot more in working with the nursery industry, and that's one of the reasons. But there are many reasons, because it really is a naturally synergistic system.
Yes, I was just going to say that the numbers of introduced species equal the natives in the Galapagos Islands as well. And in recent years, the local plant lovers have created these native gardens. And this has really taken off amongst the local people. So instead of planting the sort of bougainvillea and hibiscus, you can walk down the street now and see the native opuntia and lots of native plants, and this is fully embraced by the local people.
Further comments? Ah, yes.
With regard to native indigenous populations and their stewardship of their own resources, this is what underlies the Field Museum's approach to conservation in general, that allowing native populations to determine their own fate is probably the best way that we have of managing these incredibly complex ecosystems. The more interference that we bring to them, the more complexity we're visited with. So we find that probably the simplest and the least courageous scientific path is to simply listen to the indigenous populations.
If one takes a slightly longer evolutionary look at this question of stewardship by indigenous populations, then I would argue the only continent where the indigenous population has looked after its environment is actually Africa, because wherever else we as humans went, when we came out of Africa, the megafauna disappeared in a flash. So everything that was over 50 kilos was wiped out in short periods of time. So while then perhaps a secondary need for stewardship arose to still be able to live in these newly conquered continents, the Africans are the only ones who've managed to maintain sort of intact ecosystems throughout the evolution of humans, and we perhaps want to look at that part of the world to actually learn how we can govern the rest, because as far as megafauna is concerned, we haven't done a good job out of it anywhere but in Africa, and I think that speaks for the world in general.
Although it won't be out for almost a year, I want to point out that David Western, Jonah Western, has a brilliant book that he's written based on growing up in Kenya, based on his detailed knowledge of the Maasai and other indigenous people, which addresses exactly that question in a beautiful way. What's natural conservation? What did they do? How does it move on? How did they move on? And in a way, by being absolutely realistic and descriptive, it takes the values from all of those systems and then gets on to the current world. We always have, when we're talking about indigenous people, this serious problem of saying, you have to keep doing what you're doing. But putting that aside, your point about Africa is totally correct, in my opinion. After reviewing that book especially, I gained great insight into exactly why they can coexist there, exactly what that means, how you can have herds of cattle and wild game and all the rest. That part of the world and those practices are changing rapidly too, but it's a very valid observation, I feel. Now, we're about at the point where we should break for lunch, but if anyone wants to prevent us from getting to lunch, please. Yes, there's some comment there? No, afraid. Okay, well, I want to thank all the participants in this session, which I think was an extraordinarily good one and will be very much appreciated when published. And I want to remind again that our chair has asked us to look carefully at the concluding remarks from this meeting during the lunch period and pass them back in so that they can be thought of in terms of what we're going to have at the end of this meeting for general suggestions. Thank you all very much for your contributions and for your attention and for your questions, and we'll break for lunch and then look forward very much to the afternoon session. Thank you.